The sky was a curtain of absolute blackness, with no stars, no moon, only the howling wind and the furious waves crashing against the hull of the Northern Star. The fishing boat rocked violently, tossed around like a child's toy in the hands of something much bigger than us. Every man on board was soaked to the bone, the freezing wind cutting through our clothes like knives. I gripped the railing, my fingers numb from the cold, and forced myself to focus. This wasn't the first storm I had seen, but something about this one felt off. The waves weren't just high, they were wrong, moving in erratic patterns, like something underneath was pushing them, shaping them. A gust of wind howled through the deck, followed by the first sound. Thud. A dull, heavy knock against the hull. Then another. Thud. I turned, glancing at Marcos, one of the older fishermen. He had been at sea for years, yet his expression mirrored my own unease. Probably debris, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The wind carried the sound away, but a few moments later, it came again. Thud, 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 more deliberate this time, rhythmic, as if something or someone was tapping against the boat. Marcos walked over to the railing and peered into the darkness. "Can't see a damn thing," he said, wiping the rain from his eyes. "Maybe driftwood from another ship." But even as he spoke, a flicker of lightning split the sky, illuminating the ocean for the briefest moment. And that's when I saw them. Shadows, shapes moving just below the surface. Not the swell of waves or the flicker of fish. These were figures shifting, lurking just beyond our vision. Another flash of lightning struck, and this time, I saw something rise and disappear beneath the water. My breath caught in my throat. It was pale, almost white against the blackness of the sea. A hand. For a long moment, I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the storm, a fragment of my imagination blurred by the flickering lightning. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. A hand, pale, bloated, rising from the depths before slipping silently beneath the waves. Marcos must have sensed my tension because he stepped closer, shaking his head as he looked out over the side. "You're seeing things," he said, though there was an edge to his voice. A hesitation. Then, the sound came again. Thud, thud, thud. But this time, it was not against the hull. It was closer. Something was tapping the side of the boat, just beneath the surface, like knuckles rapping against wood. My stomach tightened as I moved toward the railing. The rain poured in thick sheets, and the darkness swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. But my gut told me something was out there. A bolt of lightning cracked the sky again, and for a fraction of a second, the sea was illuminated. That's when we saw them. Dozens of hands, pale, bloated, clawing at the surface of the water. Marcos cursed and stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet deck. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. I gripped the railing, unable to look away. The hands were rising and falling with the waves, fingers twitching, reaching, searching. The worst part, there was no sound. No splashing, no gasping for air. Just silent, desperate movements. Then, one of them grabbed the hull. A sharp, deliberate scrape echoed through the deck as nails, long, jagged, and human, dragged against the wood. I gasped, stepping back. The hand held on, fingers tightening, knuckles bending at unnatural angles. "Get away from it," Marcos shouted, pulling me back. Another hand emerged, then another. The tapping turned into something more, a dull, persistent banging, as if whatever was in the water wanted in. I stumbled backward, bumping into Roberto, another fisherman who had been watching silently until now. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted. "What the hell is that?" he asked. No one had an answer. Then, one of the hands moved higher. It was climbing. The hand didn't just cling to the hull, it crawled higher, inch by inch, its bloated fingers leaving streaks of moisture on the wood. I felt my stomach twist as I realized what was happening. It wasn't just a stray limb drifting in the waves. Something was climbing aboard. Marcos let out a string of curses, his hands gripping the railing as if grounding himself. Roberto, still frozen in place, suddenly seemed to snap out of his trance. He grabbed a fishing gaff from the deck, a long metal hook attached to a wooden pole, and took a step forward. "I don't know what the hell this is," he muttered, voice tight with fear, "but it's getting off my damn boat." Before anyone could stop him, he drove the hook down. The sharp metal plunged deep into the pale flesh, sinking into the wrist with a sickening squelch. A second passed, an eternity, where nothing happened. Then, the hand gripped the pole. Roberto's breath caught in his throat as the fingers tightened. bones audibly creaking under the pressure. Then it pulled. He let out a startled yell as the unseen force beneath the water yanked him forward, dragging him toward the railing. Marcos and I lunged to grab him, but we were too late. In a single, fluid motion, Roberto was pulled overboard. He barely had time to scream. His body hit the water with a splash, and then silence. No thrashing, no struggle, just gone. For a moment, the three of us stood in stunned horror, our own breaths the only sound over the storm. Then, the waves parted. For the briefest second, in the dim glow of the ship's deck lights, I saw something beneath the surface. A shape, a face. It was pale, bloated, its eyes milky white and sunken deep into its skull. Its mouth hung slightly open, as if whispering something, and surrounding it more hands, more faces, more things. Marcos was the first to move. "Inside," he rasped. "Now." I didn't argue. We ran. As we stumbled into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us, I could still hear it, soft, rhythmic, tapping against the hull. They weren't done yet. We slammed the door shut and locked it. The three of us, Marcos, Joao, and I, stood there panting, soaked to the bone, staring at one another. The cabin was small, dimly lit by a flickering overhead bulb, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the walls felt suffocating. No one spoke. No one had to. Roberto was gone, ripped away like he had never existed. The radio crackled behind us. Marcos lunged for it, his fingers trembling as he turned the dial. "Mayday, mayday. This is the Northern Star. We've lost a man overboard. We're under attack by..." He hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. What the hell were we under attack by? The radio responded with nothing but static. Come on. Marcos twisted the dial, but all we got was white noise. At first, I thought it was just interference from the storm. But then, buried beneath the static, I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, like a voice speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. Joao stepped closer, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" We listened. The voice, if it was a voice, was repeating something over and over, a single phrase distorted by the static. "Open the door." I took a step back, my chest tightening. "Open the door." A loud bang against the hull made us all jump. Then another. The tapping had returned, but now it was louder. More hands, more knocking, more demanding. Joao turned toward the window, his breath fogging up the glass. "We need to keep the engine running," he muttered. "We need to move. Get the hell out of here." He was right, but when Marcos reached for the controls, the engine was already running. And yet, we weren't moving. I swallowed hard. The ocean was holding us in place. Another bang, this time on the cabin door. Joao stumbled back. There on the deck. Marcos shook his head violently. "No, they can't be. They drowned, for God's sake. This isn't possible." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The voices on the radio blended together in a rising chorus of whispers. My skin crawled. And then, the handle of the door began to turn. The handle jerked violently. For a split second, none of us moved. We just stared, paralyzed, as it rattled in its socket. Something was trying to get in. Joao let out a shaky breath, stepping back toward the farthest corner of the cabin. Marcos, jaw clenched, braced himself near the door. I could hear his breathing, ragged, uneven. The fear was sinking in. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rattling stopped. Silence. The only sound was the faint crackling of the radio, the whispers still murmuring beneath the static. The cabin felt like a tomb, the air thick with something unnatural. Joao swallowed hard. Maybe it's the wind," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. Marcos shook his head. "That wasn't the damn wind." I took a slow step toward the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The glass was fogged up from the warmth of our breath, but as I wiped it with my sleeve, I felt my stomach drop. There was a face staring back at me. Bloated, pale, eyes sunken deep into its skull. It hovered just beyond the glass, mouth moving soundlessly, as if whispering something I couldn't hear. I stumbled back with a choked gasp. Jesus! That was when Joao rushed to the door and unlatched it. Marcos lunged forward. "No! What the hell are you doing?" But Joao wasn't listening. His eyes were glazed over, his expression empty, like a man in a trance. He pulled the door open, and the storm swallowed him whole. The wind ripped through the cabin, nearly knocking me off my feet. I caught a glimpse of Joao as he stepped outside, his arms limp, his movements unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. No scream, no struggle. The darkness took him without hesitation. I stood there, panting, my pulse thundering in my ears. Marcos was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. We had just watched him walk to his death. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if he had gone willingly, or if something had called him. The door slammed shut behind Joao, but neither Marcos nor I moved to open it again. We just stood there, our breathing shallow, our bodies stiff, staring at the place where he had been. A minute passed, then another. No screams, no footsteps, nothing. The storm outside still howled, but Joao was simply gone, swallowed by the dark. Marcos muttered a curse under his breath and grabbed the door handle. "What the hell are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his wrist. "We can't just leave him out there," he shot back, his voice raw. But I could see it in his eyes. He knew Joao was dead. Another sound drifted through the cabin. A voice. Soft. Haunting. A song. It didn't come from the radio. It didn't come from outside. It came from everywhere. It was low, melodic, almost soothing. A woman's voice, humming an unfamiliar tune. The kind of song that makes your chest ache with something you can't explain. Marcos turned to me, his face pale. "You hear that?" I nodded. I wished I didn't. The song grew louder. The melody twisted, something wrong hidden beneath its beauty. It felt like it was reaching into my head, pulling at something inside me. Marcos's grip on the door handle loosened. His eyes glazed over. "No," I muttered, stepping in front of him. "Don't listen to it." He blinked, his breath hitching. I wasn't going to. A shadow passed by the window. We both froze. Something moved outside. Not Joao. Not a man. Something else. It was watching us. And then, the tapping started again. The tapping started softly at first. A single knock. Then another. Slow. Rhythmic. Then it spread. More hands. More fingers rapping against the walls of the cabin, against the glass of the window, against the wooden deck. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, coordinated, like a chorus of unseen hands drumming out some ancient, forgotten ritual. Marcos and I backed away from the door. My breathing was shallow, my skin cold despite the suffocating weight of the cabin air. Then we heard it. A footstep. On the deck. Heavy. Wet. Inside the boat. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I saw Marcos's wide eyes staring past me. Something was moving outside the cabin. We weren't alone anymore. The radio crackled, and through the static, the whispers returned. But this time, I could understand them. "You have been heard." I slammed my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop the voices. They were inside my skull, sliding through my thoughts like cold fingers running down my spine. Marcos wasn't moving. His face was blank, his breathing shallow. He was listening. I grabbed his arm. "Marcos, stay with me." No response. His eyes twitched toward the door. The handle began to turn again. He took a step forward. No. I grabbed his arm harder, but his body was slack, his muscles unresponsive. It was like something had reached into his mind and switched him off, left only a shell behind. He took another step. I did the only thing I could. I punched him. The hit snapped him back, just as the door creaked open an inch. Marcos gasped, stumbling backward, and I kicked the door shut, slamming the lock into place. He blinked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell just happened? I didn't know how to answer him. Then, another footstep. It was still inside the boat. Marcos's gaze flicked to the window, his lips parting in horror. I turned just in time to see something press against the glass. A pale face, sunken eyes. Its lips moved, but no sound came out. Then slowly, it smiled, and the cabin light went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. The weak cabin light had been our only tether to reality, and now it was gone. The air inside the room felt heavy, dense, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. Marcos and I stood frozen, listening. Somewhere outside, the tapping had stopped. That was worse. I reached blindly for something, anything to hold on to. My fingers found the edge of the radio, still hissing with static. I twisted the dial, my breath shaky. Nothing. Then a whisper. "You are almost ready." I threw the radio to the ground, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Marcos exhaled sharply beside me, shaking his head like he was trying to clear it. And then, a sudden jolt. The boat lurched forward, knocking us both off our feet. A deep, guttural creak echoed through the hull, as if something massive was shifting beneath us. What the hell was that? Marcos gasped, scrambling to his knees. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. The floor beneath us was moving, not like the usual rocking of the waves. Something was pulling the boat. A shudder ran through the vessel, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm vanished. The howling wind died in an instant. The relentless rain ceased. The deafening crashes of the waves settled into an eerie, glassy stillness. The northern star was adrift in a sea of perfect calm. The clouds had parted, revealing an empty expanse of water stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no sign of the storm, no sign of Joao, no sign of the hands. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw something else, a light on the horizon. Marcos turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think?" He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Rescue. It had to be. I stumbled toward the controls, my hands trembling as I tried to steer toward the distant glow. The engine roared to life, as if whatever force had been holding us in place had finally let go. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope. We drifted for hours, the light slowly growing closer. And then, just as dawn broke over the horizon, we saw it. A fishing vessel, its hull rusted, its deck worn with years of use. The crew stood at the edge, waving us in. We were saved. Marcos collapsed onto the console, letting out a broken laugh. I felt the same relief flooding my veins, pushing out the cold terror that had gripped me for so long. A radio crackled to life on their deck, and a voice rang through the air. "Northern Star, do you copy? We've been picking up strange interference from your coordinates. Are you in distress?" I grabbed our own radio, my throat raw. "Yes, we lost 2 men, overboard. We need help." The static swallowed my words. And then, a new voice, one I recognized, a voice that shouldn't have been there. "Open the door." My stomach turned to ice. Marcos and I exchanged a look, our blood running cold. Slowly, almost mechanically, we turned toward the hull of our boat. The rescuers had thrown us a rope. One of them was stepping aboard, but before his feet even touched the deck, we saw them, handprints, dozens, stamped into the wet wood. Familiar, too familiar, because they weren't just handprints. They were ours. And before I could speak, the whisper came again. "You never left. The sea had already claimed us."